We're going to bring on our first guest of the night. He joins us from out in Seattle. He's a writer, investigative reporter, author for the Seattle Times. Wrote a book, a really interesting book, very apropos, even though it was about the Washington University college football team, all the off-the-field troubles that they went through. Won several awards. It's called Scoreboard, Baby. We want to bring on Ken Armstrong tonight, not only just to talk about that book, but obviously what's going on with Penn State and kind of the state of college football. And Ken joined us by telephone tonight. And Ken, thanks for joining us. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Good to have a chance to talk to you. Doug Miles Don Henderson here.
There in Seattle, your pro football team had a big upset yesterday, so a lot of activity there yesterday.
They did. We don't get a lot of good sports news here in Seattle, so when we actually do get one of those wins, it's cause to celebrate.
How do you explain not only the Seattle kind of an up and down year for them, but Baltimore an up and down year? I don't think anybody would have predicted that the Ravens, after playing so well the previous week, goes out there and loses to Seattle. I guess that is pretty big news out there.
Yeah, it is for us. Yeah, I guess as big a news you can have when you're still 3-6.
Right.
So, for Seattle, we've been down so long with the Mariners and the Seahawks, and then losing the Sonics, that we'll take whatever we can get at this point. And the win over Baltimore is in a good column.
Absolutely, and we'll get around to a little of this college basketball and college sports in general in just a second, but a good friend of mine, Dave Sims, is out there with you with the baseball program. Worked with Dave for a number of years in Philadelphia, and so if you see him in your travels, be sure you tell him I said hello.
Okay.
How's the media? I'm going to say, how's the media feel about Pete Carroll out there, Ken? Really a quick exit from USC to take that head coaching job last year. Of course, they did make the playoffs, even though they didn't have a great record. But this year, like you said, 3-6. What's the thought out there about Carroll?
Well, it's kind of hard to get a gauge on that because, as you're saying, like they made the playoffs last year, but they made the playoffs with a losing record, and they won the first game, but then they lost in the second, and it's just hard to figure out what to make of it. And I think the fact that what's happened at USC is continuing to play out, right? And they're still trying to figure out who knew what when. I think if it's possible for the jury still to be out 2 years later, here the jury's still out. I think people are still waiting to see if Pete Carroll can actually turn the franchise around here. I'm not sure we're convinced yet, but we'll see.
You think they'll give him another year or possibly two? There really hadn't been any rumblings of dissatisfaction as yet.
I think so. I mean, it's a program that's been down for a while, so I think the inclination is to give him time to build.
I know fans of the Patriots and even the Jets that have seen Pete before in the NFL, they don't have high regard for his NFL abilities, although he did a great job with USC until the end there. But I like to say the jury has been out on Carroll for a long time as far as being an NFL head coach.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what is it that allows a coach to succeed so spectacularly at the college level and struggle at the professional level. I mean, certainly we've seen that more often than not, right? It's the exception, the coach who does well at the college level who's able to carry that over into the professional ranks. But you wonder if it's the recruiting, the amount of time you get, the age of the kids, who knows what it is. But it's pretty clear that it's hard to move back and forth between those two levels.
Well, you're exactly right, but you see it down the coast a little bit because the 49ers certainly went right from Stanford right to the 49ers, and what a job he's done.
He is, and he would be the exception, right? Yeah. And it's remarkable what he's done because what he did at Stanford was incredible, and now what he's doing with the 49ers is equally so.
Talking with Ken Armstrong, author of the book Scoreboard, Baby, a story of college football crime and complicity. I guess, if we didn't know this book was about the University of Washington, you could almost say that's the title of what's going on at Penn State. Is it kind of an eerie feeling for you, Ken, having written a book about a different school and now this story comes out?
It's funny. Eerie is the word I've been using, because the parallels between what happened at the University of Washington in 2000 and what's going on at Penn State right now are really striking. What we wrote about with the University of Washington was how the team in this one season in 2000 found so much success on the field. They were just winning one game after another, coming from behind, often winning in the most dramatic fashion possible. But off the field, all of these players, key players, were getting in trouble with the law. You had one player who was accused of rape. Another was being investigated for robbing and shooting a drug dealer. Another had an extensive history of domestic violence. But time and again, all of the institutions in the community, prosecutors, judges, police, people with the university, from administrators to faculty members to coaches, weren't holding these players to account. It seemed to be that what was most important to these folks was allowing these players to continue suiting up instead of sending a message that really special treatment, special privileges have no place here. And I think that's what you're finding at Penn State. The other parallel is that University of Washington went off the rails when it learned of criminal accusations and sometimes elected to keep it within the university walls, to deal with it internally as opposed to going to police. And that's certainly what led to Penn State's problems. This culture of secrecy, this lack of transparency, this decision to not let it go to the police department for fear of what the resulting publicity might be. That's a mistake you just see play out time and again with college programs and with other programs as well.
Ken, I could almost see it back in 2000 because we didn't have the forms of communication. I just can't imagine how we could go from 1998 to almost 2012 with all the Twitters, with all the things that are going on. I just can't imagine even going before the judiciary 2 years ago when they first, levied the complaint. I can't imagine how it could go that long in this day and age as opposed to 2000 as it's gone.
Well, it all depends on who's in control of the information, right? Because, if it doesn't spread far and wide, it's not going to reach somebody who's liberal with their Twitter account, and isn't going to tweet the news. That's what we were finding at Washington. And I suspect the same thing could play out now. If they kept tight control over the circle of people who knew about what was going on, I think you could still keep it secret if you wanted to.
Well, boy, they can't keep any secrets in Washington, but they sure kept it for 13 years at Penn State and College Station. I mean, unbelievable to me because, somebody had to tell their wife had to tell somebody else had to tell somebody else. I mean, 13 years. I mean, that's unbelievable in this day and age.
It is pretty remarkable. We had a similar thing play out at Washington in 2000, which kind of defies belief. The 2000 season started in September for the UW. In March of that year, 6 months before the season began, one of the team's best players, who's a linebacker named Jeremiah Farms, he robbed and shot a drug dealer and stole a pound of marijuana from him. The drug dealer was lucky to live. The bullet lodged in him near his spine, but he wound up surviving. But within an hour of the shooting, police knew that Farms was their chief suspect because they had all kinds of circumstantial evidence pointing to him. In fact, one detective told the lead detective, your guy's going to be number 4, Jeremiah Farms. But he wasn't charged. Then 2 months before the season began, police were able to link Farms to the crime through a fingerprint match, a fingerprint that was left at the scene. Still, he wasn't charged. Between the second and third games of the season, they had DNA evidence that linked Farms to the crime. Still, he wasn't charged. He wasn't charged until after the season was over, until after the Rose Bowl had been won, and after Farms had been drafted in the NFL by the Cleveland Browns. And what people said then was, we didn't know. So that for 14 months, this investigation's going on, and they're collecting evidence, as I was saying, circumstantial evidence, fingerprint evidence, DNA evidence, and yet at the end of it, everybody says, well, we didn't know he was being investigated. It makes you wonder.
Yeah, it's very difficult to, Doug and I have talked, and we've had so many guests on over the last 6 months or so since all these conference teams have been changing, going one way or the other. And let's face it all really comes right down to the presidents of the universities who are not fulfilling the contracts that they have with the current commitments that they have to the conferences that they're in, and saying, well, West Virginia, I'll take as an example, they're saying, well, after the bowl game we're going to participate in this continue. And that's the way it is with Syracuse. That's the way it is with Pittsburgh. I mean, the presidents of the universities, to me, are just, not honoring any contracts. Well, why do they think the kids should honor any contracts?
I think the presidents of these universities are often in a peculiar position. And I think we saw this play out at Penn State, where they often feel that they don't have as much clout as a football coach, particularly in these Division I schools. What I found really interesting was how the news broke about the decision that the university made to fire Joe Paterno and to fire Graham Spanier. I mean, you probably noticed the same thing. The stories all led out with Joe Paterno being fired, and then almost as an afterthought, oh, by the way, the university president was fired as well. And it almost shows how, in the public mind, we rank the football coach above the university president in terms of stature or importance. And I can tell you in Seattle, if the University of Washington president was fired, it would be big news. I mean, it's our largest employer. It's a source of great civic pride. Yet at Penn State, this longtime president is fired, yet he's not quite a footnote, but it was always the secondary mention, after the football coach. And it just tells us where our priorities are.
And he was one of four because they got the athletic director, the assistant athletic director, they got Joe.
Right.
And how in the world they could keep, and I still haven't figured this one out, how they could keep the original wide receiver coach that was the one that was supposedly going to notify everybody.
Oh, McQuarrie, yeah.
The one that testified at the hearings, and he's still there.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like Pennsylvania has a very strange duty to report law that is full of ambiguity, and it's unclear who's covered by which provisions of it. Because you're right. How is it that Joe Paterno's obligation is satisfied by telling his supervisor, his immediate superior, but other people had an obligation to go immediately to police or to go to police? I'm not sure I understand where they've drawn those lines or how they've done it. And you're right, with Mike McQuarrie, even beyond reporting it, I think people are really asking, why in the world didn't he stop it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He's a 28-year-old young man who was captain of the football team, who was a coach, and you mean to tell me that he doesn't have a responsibility to immediately, first of all, stop it, and secondly, go right to the authorities. I mean, I realize there's a chain of command under Joe Paterno. I mean, he runs everything. But at the same time, if you walked into a locker room and saw something like that, I mean, there's nothing in the world that would stop you from making a move.
Yeah, it just seems like it's almost a mistake to view it in legal terms, because it's really the moral component that should hold sway here. And it's really hard to understand how that didn't happen. And even when he did report it, he waited a day. Which
Next morning. He did it the next morning. You're right.
Right. And I don't. It's just hard to fathom, how you can not do something immediately, to try to help that young boy.
Well, we went through so many situations when Bobby Knight was in Indiana, and I knew Bobby well, and broadcast games at Assembly Hall, and was there many, many times. And it was one incident after another incident after another incident. And as you said, the college president, for whatever reason, or the Big Ten, were more afraid of Bobby than they were of correcting the problem. Until it just got so far out of hand, they had to do something.
Yeah. And, and Bobby Knight's actually a really good comparison, right? Because not only did he have success on the court, but he was always considered to be somebody, even if you didn't like him personally, his players graduated.
Absolutely.
He paid attention to the academic side of the equation. He seemed, in a lot of ways, frankly, to be a good public face for the university if you could put aside the temper and the belligerence and those things. Whereas you look at Paterno, and I think a lot of people thought he was the whole package, right? I mean, success on the field, success off the field. And I think that's why this story has had the traction that it has, is that he was such an iconic figure. The university always considered itself to be a cut above in terms of winning with integrity. And this is about the ugliest spectacle you can imagine at any school. And for it to be at Penn State under Paterno would have almost been unthinkable, I think, 2 months ago.
Doug?
Talking with Ken Armstrong, author, co-author of Scoreboard, Baby, a story of college football crime and complicity, a University of Washington team back in the 2000 season. And Ken, I know you kind of put this book together from, you did a lot of investigative reporting through articles and put the book together out of that. How was that to kind of get in there, or did you come up with a lot of obstruction as far as trying to get information when you were doing the original stories on the team?
Actually, we were able to put it together through records, through documents that became available years after that season was played. Mm-hmm. There were a number of lawsuits that were filed that generated depositions, pleadings, in the court file. There were investigations conducted by an ethics board here, which produced a pretty rich trove of records. And there were criminal investigations that finally came to a conclusion, and we were able to see the underlying records. And what we found time and again was that people in positions of authority simply had their priorities out of whack. We found a case where a judge sentenced one player to 30 days in jail. This is a player who had gotten into trouble extensively, but she put in her sentencing order to be served after football season. That was an explicit condition of her order. There was another judge who was confronted with a player who was beating his wife. He had choked her until she passed out unconscious. He had broken her arm. And in this one particular instance, he had punched her in the face, breaking her nose. And when police had arrived that night, they had found puddles of blood around the couple's bed and a trail of droplets running to the bathroom. It was really a pretty gruesome scene. But at a pretrial hearing, when the judge is confronted with this player, what's he want to talk to him about? He talks to him about the previous year's game at Notre Dame. He talks to him about redshirting and weightlifting and spring drills. They talk football. Here's a player who broke his wife's nose, and the judge is talking football. And we just found this time and again where people lost sight of what was most important at a given time. And all that enthusiasm they had on Saturday afternoon continued on Tuesday when they're in a courtroom, or on Wednesday when they're in a classroom. People simply were having difficulty segregating these different aspects of life. And it really went to my mind, to sports culture as a whole, and the way that sometimes sports has such a hold on us that we lose sight of what's most important.
What was the adjudication of the young man that shot the drug dealer?
He wound up being convicted of robbery and going to prison for 3 years. And then when he got out, he played arena football for a little while. And then he got in trouble again, and he was convicted of a gun charge down in California and was sent back to prison.
Wow. What do you expect the fallout to be for Penn State? Similar multiple lawsuits, Ken?
I would be very surprised if there weren't multiple lawsuits, and they'll be filed against the university as well, obviously, as Sandusky. And what they're going to allege is that the university didn't do enough to protect these kids, that they didn't hold, they failed in their duty report. They're going to be accused of violating the Clery Act. They're going to be accused of negligence under a multitude of different theories. I have a feeling that this is a story that we're going to still be reading about 2, 3, 4 years down the road.
I agree with you 100%, and I think also that you're going to have the civil action against the individual coaches too. I mean, not just Sandusky, but you're going to have, civil suits from Joe Pa right on down.
You are, and I think what's interesting, I imagine it was the same in Tampa as it was, here in the opposite corner of the country. But when you would go into a restaurant or a bar this week, what you kept seeing on television screens, on top of that crawler, was images of Penn State students rioting and smashed windows and light poles that were pulled down. I think the damage to the university as a whole is something that Penn State needs to deal with before it worries about its football program. I think people see Penn State in a different light now. And if I were at the university, I would want to do everything I could to make sure that we're sending out the right message across the board, and that the concern we express is not for what's going to happen to our football team a year from now, but what's going to happen to these kids, and what are we going to do as a university to make sure that our priorities are in order.
Well, Ken, I hope you're right, but if you saw the game on Saturday as I did, and then you saw the activities post-game, and even into Sunday night, I mean, they're still going to Joe's house, they're still putting signs up, and everything's very, very positive for the football program, and even on ESPN, how well the team took the field and how well they represented Penn State University in the face of all the adversity, and now they're ready to go against Ohio State this week. I hope your summation is correct, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what they should do. but you're right, Don. I don't know that's what they will do. And you know, even when you were talking about ESPN, I was struck by some of the initial coverage of it. You know, even within the first 72 hours
Right.
of the news breaking, there were stories wondering about what's going to happen to Penn State in terms of its ability to recruit. It was being cast in football terms.
Right.
And boy, we found the same thing at the University of Washington. There was a key player on the UW named Jeremy Stevens. He'd be familiar to you down in Tampa because he
Right.
played for the Bucks after the Seahawks. That year, he was being investigated on suspicion of rape, and everybody knew it because he had been arrested by a SWAT team. So it was a high-profile arrest, and the question that was before the prosecutor's office was whether or not they were going to file charges against him. Well, what was interesting to me was that in the sports pages, there was story after story written about if he is charged and if he is suspended, what is this going to mean for the football team and its prospects for reaching the Rose Bowl? It was cast in sports terms, and to me, when you're dealing with an accusation where one person's life has been turned upside down and another person is facing the possibility of prison, do you really want to ask the question of what will this mean for the Rose Bowl? You know, what will this mean for the football team? That, to me, falls well down the list of what questions you should be asking at that moment. But again, it's just another example of how sports can twist the way we think about things.
Well, there was great difference of opinion on ESPN, and I guess through the news media entirely. I don't have a list of pluses and minuses, but there were a great number of people that said, you know, let Joe coach and break the record because, as you know, he was tied, and you know, let Joe break the record or let him finish out the season and then fire him, or terminate him now but tell him that he can coach till the end of the season. It wasn't until it really got hot and heavy, as you said, on campus and the difficult. That's when the board trustees took action. I mean, there were a lot of people that just said, you know, we know Joe was wrong, but he should be able to stay and finish out the season. You know, that was the way it started.
I think it also took a little bit of time for people to read, you know, the grand jury indictments, you know, and to take in the full gravity of what had happened, you know, how many kids were involved and how long a period this covered. I think once people started getting more grounded in the facts, it became easier to see that certain people had to go.
And also that the foundation was really harbored right at Penn State. He was able to use all the facilities, even though he didn't work there any longer. You know, they knew about it, and they allowed him to continue to use the facilities and foster the university for his playground. I mean, that even made it worse.
You know, it's absolutely chilling. I was talking with a friend the other day. We were talking about what it must feel like at Ohio State these days, because, you know, obviously a lot of attention was paid to what happened there and to Jim Tressel being shown the door. But, you know, when you look at what Tressel was accused of not disclosing, which was that, you know, he became aware that some of his players are getting free tattoos and are trading memorabilia, and he doesn't report that, which he should have. But compare that to what the people at Penn State weren't reporting. And I think that's why it's so shocking. I can't think of any parallels in the history of college football that you can bring up to and really juxtapose with what happened at Penn State. It's just absolutely chilling.
Ken, before we wrap up, can you talk a little bit before we wrap up, Ken, about Rick Neuheisel? You talk about the coach of Washington there. He kind of had a bit of a checkered history, a bit controversial figure even after leaving Washington. What are your thoughts on him?
You know, he is an interesting guy. He was the coach at Washington during the 2000 season, and he really did not have a tight rein on the team in any way, shape, or form. What I find interesting about him is that after the book came out, you know, he was asked about it, and he said repeatedly that he looks back on it and he realizes that he really screwed up, and that he wishes he had it to do over again. He says in particular he screwed up with Jeremy Stevens, that it was a mistake not to suspend him, you know, for an extended stretch instead of simply for half a football game. And when you look at what he's been doing at UCLA, he has been suspending players. He's been kicking some off the team, including some highly prized players. I think he's actually been walking the walk down there. He hasn't been winning a lot, you know, but I don't think that UCLA has seen the problems that you saw at Colorado before Washington and then at Washington. Maybe different problems, you know, but I think that he really has kind of taken some of this to heart and has been applying it down at UCLA.
One last question from me. You got sort of a famous name from New York. Ken Armstrong used to be a great kicker years ago. You're not any relation to the Armstrong who was a field goal kicker for the Giants many years ago, are you?
If I am, I don't know of it.
Well, it's a great sports name, Armstrong. So we've been talking with Ken Armstrong, who co-authored the book Scoreboard, Baby, also a reporter investigative reporter for the Seattle Times. And Ken, you have a website people can get a hold of you or the book?
Sure. The book's website is scoreboardbaby.net, and there's a lot of information about it there. And my personal website is kenarmstrong.us.
Great.
You can be contacted through there.
Great. I'll tell you, it was a real pleasure having an opportunity to talk with you, and have been to Seattle. I used to do the 76ers for a number of years, and we had some great games out there when Jack Ramsey was coaching, and Dvorak and the boys were playing, and Bill Walton, the last game I guess he ever really played, or at least the half of it, was against the 76ers, and so we had a lot of great times out in Seattle.
You know, it was a great basketball town. They're still hopeful that they'll get an NBA team back. Maybe they will.
Well, they just got sort of messed up on trying to play in crazy facilities. Trying to play in that King Dome out there was a little tough.
It was, yeah. And you know, they got sideways with David Stern, and
right.
It just got ugly pretty quickly.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with us, and give us your website one more time, and we really appreciate it.
Sure. The book's website is scoreboardbaby.net.
Great. Ken Armstrong been our guest. Ken, we'll look forward to talking to you down the road, and thanks for being with us tonight.